I was a geek in high school. It's taken me a long time to be able to say that proudly. For a long time I was in denial. I even did some ungeek-like things as a teenager, like being a Boy Scout and trying out for the golf team. Still, I was the only Boy Scout in my troop who could find 15 edible plants within 20 feet of the campsite, and I'd even eat them for $1. Okay, seriously, I'd eat them just because I could. Or at least I thought I could. You're supposed to clean and cook stinging nettle before you put it in your mouth, but that's another story. As for the golf team, I tried out for it, and didn't make it. I was too humiliated to even think about trying out for the croquet team. At least I wasn't a nerd. Most people don't realize that geek and nerd aren't really synonymous. Maybe that's because I'm the only person who thinks there's a difference, but I keep hoping this distinction will catch on, even though adolescence is hard enough without throwing labels into the mix, especially since no one really fits into a specific category. In spite of what movies try to tell us, high school, like the rest of life, is not really a place where everyone can be easily pigeonholed as sportos, motorheads, geeks, sluts, bloods, wastoids, and dweebies. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by John Hughes films, since none of us ever came out of a day of detention, a long-distance trip, or a prom invaded by vampires, with our lives significantly improved. If high school had a plot, it was Lord of the Flies one day and Gilligan's Island the next, and there was a time and place where jocks, metalheads, and even nerds and geeks could be equals. I think it was behind the greenhouse, before gym. Anyway, the major difference between nerds and geeks, I think, is one of degree. Geeks dress up as their favorite Star Trek character for Halloween. Nerds dress up as their favorite Star Trek character for Casual Fridays. Geeks played Dungeons and Dragons. Nerds insisted on being called Viklas the Orc Smiter even when they weren't playing Dungeons and Dragons. Geeks play video games. Nerds write video games. And while nerds tend to be socially inept, geeks are generally a little more, well, ept. Not that I'm knocking nerds. Several decades ago, nerds started playing around with these things called computers, which would eventually enable them to take over the world. Nerds, in spite of having been social outcasts, are responsible for all those cool technological devices that everyone not only wants, but in fact needs, to avoid being a social outcast. Nerds belong to the math club, and went on to become highly paid engineers or scientists, professions where their idiosyncrasies are admirable, and they're often called eccentric. Geeks flunked math, but usually compensated by acing English, and often went on to professions where their idiosyncrasies are barely tolerated, and where they're often called weird or about to be fired. Geeks aren't necessarily shut out from success, though. Successful geeks write best-selling books and direct movies. Geeks design special effects and creatures for science fiction movies, and geeks play the role of creatures. Or at least they did, before nerds and their computers muscled in and figured out how to replace actors with pixels. Looking at history, I realize geeks and nerds have always been with us. Thomas Edison was a nerd. Edgar Allan Poe was a geek. Benjamin Franklin was both, because only a nerd would fly a kite in a thunderstorm, and only a geek would write an essay called Fart Proudly. Leonardo da Vinci was a geek because he painted the Mona Lisa. I know he also designed an airplane and a submarine, but if he'd been a nerd, those designs would actually work. In fact, the geek-nerd dichotomy is everywhere. Whole wheat bread is geeky. Vitamin-fortified white bread is nerdy. Lime jello is nerdy. Black cherry soda is geeky. All Chinese food is nerdy, except mushu. All sushi is geeky, except California rolls. Pudding is nerdy. Ice cream is geeky. DVDs are geeky. Streaming video is nerdy. Although it wasn't that long ago that DVDs were nerdy and videotapes were geeky. And don't get me started on Blu-ray, because I really don't want to have to buy Forbidden Planet again. But that's another story. Latte is nerdy. Cappuccino is geeky. Making a gourmet meal from scratch is geeky. Getting expensive takeout is nerdy. Shakespeare in the Park is geeky. Shakespeare on film is nerdy. Liquid soap is geeky. Body gel for men is nerdy, in spite of what the commercials tell you. Geeks know I'm parodying Lenny Bruce right now. Nerds know exactly which items I stole directly from Lenny Bruce's bit. Pretzels are nerdy. Chips are geeky. Great Britain is nerdy, and so are all of their prime ministers, except Winston Churchill. Canada is geeky, and so are all of their prime ministers, except R.B. Bennett. And we all, no matter how cool we were in high school, have a geek or nerd inside of us. So be proud and embrace your inner geek or nerd. Just don't embrace them too much. They are uncomfortable with physical contact.
Particle man, doing the things a particle can. What's he like? It's not important. Particle man, is he a dot or is he a speck? When he's underwater, does he get wet? Or does the water get him instead? Nobody knows.